some secrets linger not in letters or duels, but in the silence of the heart. Tonight's mystery begins with a Russian count in London, a veiled lady moving in shadows, and a rival thought, long dead, who returns with vengeance burning in his eyes. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, step with me into the drawing rooms and hidden alleys where Holmes waits to unravel the truth. It has long been my habit, when the press of my professional duties allows, to cast my mind back over those singular adventures which I shared with my remarkable friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Many of these have already found their way into print, while others, for reasons of delicacy or discretion, have remained locked within my notes. Yet there is one case in particular which I have never before dared to disclose, a matter which touched upon international relations of the most precarious kind, and which, had it not been for Holmes's extraordinary powers, might have led to scandal of a most grievous order. The events I now set down occurred in the later years of our association, at a time when the bustle of London life was punctuated by the uneasy stirrings of political intrigue. Nations watched one another with suspicion. Secret agents moved as shadows through the capital, and even in the quiet sitting room of Baker Street, there arrived hints of those larger conflicts that threatened to shake the peace of Europe. I remember with clarity the chill of that morning, for the fog had lain heavy upon the streets, muffling the rattle of the hansoms and lending to the city a mournful stillness. Holmes had been at his violin, bowing out some strange and plaintive melody, when the knock came at our door. It was the prelude to an affair which brought to us not only a client of distinguished position, but also a mystery steeped in the passions and politics of far-off St. Petersburg. Our visitor was ushered in by Mrs. Hudson, his countenance betraying an agitation he strove in vain to suppress. He was a gentleman of middle years, impeccably dressed, yet with the pallor of one who has endured a sleepless night. His lips were tight, his eyes restless, and his hands fidgeted with a leather portfolio he carried as though it were both burden and shield. "Mr. Holmes," said he, after Holmes had motioned him to a chair, "my name must remain discreet for the present. You may, however, take it that I represent certain official interests of His Majesty's government. I come to you in no private capacity, but in fear of a scandal which, should it break upon the public, would imperil both honour and peace." Holmes regarded him with that half-lidded gaze of his, fingers steepled together as though every twitch of the man's expression were another line in some silent cipher. "Proceed, sir," he said quietly. The gentleman swallowed, then leaned forward. "There is in London at this hour a Russian nobleman of high lineage, Count Alexei Orloff. His presence is no secret, for he attends certain embassies and is known to many of our diplomats. But it is what lies beneath his visit that gives me cause for alarm. He has already been approached, nay, threatened, by parties unknown. Unless we act swiftly, his situation may erupt into public disgrace, and with it consequences of no ordinary gravity." Holmes cast a sidelong glance at me. "You perceive, Watson, that we stand on the edge of another political abyss." And turning back to the man, he said, "Tell me of these threats. Facts, if you please. No conjecture." The diplomat withdrew several folded sheets from his portfolio and laid them upon the table. They were written in a hand at once bold and distorted, the phrases a curious mixture of Russian idiom and English brevity. The message, though oblique, was unmistakable in its menace. Certain episodes from the Count's past were to be exposed unless terms were met. "The Count," said our visitor, "has begged me to seek your assistance. He dares not approach the police, for the matter touches upon secrets too delicate for such channels. The demand is couched in threats of revelation which would compromise not only his personal honour, but also the confidence reposed in him by his government. Already 3 of these notes have been delivered, each more pressing than the last." Holmes bent over the letters, his keen eyes darting across each line, while I observed the twitch of a smile at the corner of his lips. He laid them down again with care. "The boldness of the script is but a mask," said he, Here we have a hand that feigns assurance, yet betrays haste. Note, Watson, the pressure of the pen where the English words are attempted, an affectation not native to the writer. I shuddered, for the letters carried with them a certain atmosphere of menace, as though even their paper bore the taint of conspiracy. "And what, sir," I asked, "is demanded of the Count?" "Silence, doctor," replied the diplomat grimly. "They demand silence. Silence bought with gold, or else his ruin." Holmes's eyes glistened with interest. "Then let us hear from the Count himself. Words upon paper may deceive. The man's own demeanour will tell us more." It was later that very afternoon when the Count was shown into our chambers. He was a tall man, of commanding presence, with features at once handsome and stern. His uniform of dark cloth was fastidiously arranged, yet his eyes betrayed a restlessness which even his aristocratic bearing could not wholly conceal. He bowed stiffly, first to Holmes, then to myself, with the air of one compelled by necessity to seek aid where his pride would fain have forbidden it. "Mr. Holmes," said he, in accents marked by the rolling cadence of his native tongue, "you have been told something of my plight. I am a man who has known both service and sacrifice, yet now I find myself beset by shadows which reach me, even in this foreign land." Holmes indicated a chair, and the Count seated himself with the rigid posture of a soldier. I could not help but note the contrast between the strength suggested by his figure and the haunted look which passed, unbidden, across his face. "You are the victim of blackmail," said Holmes without preamble. "Of that we are already apprised. What we must learn from you is the substance of the danger, the secret which another seeks to wield against you." The Count hesitated, his jaw tightening, his gaze falling for a moment upon the carpet. "There are matters," he said at last, "which cannot be spoken lightly. In my homeland, honour is everything. Yet honour has its price, and there are those who know too much of mine. That knowledge, twisted in unscrupulous hands, may bring disgrace where once there was duty." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Then it becomes our task to wrest from these shadows the truth which they conceal. Rest assured, Count Orloff, you could not have sought counsel more discreet." As the Count's sombre eyes met mine, I felt the weight of a mystery whose consequences might well reach beyond the walls of Baker Street into the very councils of Europe. Count Orloff sat for some time in silence, his powerful frame stiff with the effort of restraint. When at last he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had borne secrets too long for comfort. "In St. Petersburg," he began, "one does not live without intrigue. A man of my station finds himself not only in the salons of nobility, but in the company of those whose whispers carry daggers." He paused, his eyes clouded by recollection. "There was talk of conspiracies, of allegiances to foreign crowns, of duels fought not for honour, but for silence." I glanced at Holmes, who leaned back in his chair, his long fingers pressed together in that familiar steeple, his eyes half closed, yet I knew from experience that no syllable escaped his attention. The Count's voice dropped. "There was a man, an officer of our army, whose hatred of me was as unyielding as steel. We crossed swords one winter's dawn. The world believes he fell. Perhaps it would have been better had it been so." His hand clenched upon the arm of the chair, the knuckles whitening with the memory. "And a woman," he added, so softly I scarcely caught the words. "Her name I cannot speak. To speak it would be to bring dishonour upon one who was once the very light of my existence." He turned his face away, as though the very act of confession were a wound reopened. The atmosphere in our sitting room seemed to thicken with the burden of his revelations. Orloff had not spoken in detail, yet from the fragments I gathered enough to perceive a past riddled with secrets, duels that might not be ended, allegiances questioned, and a woman whose absence was as haunting as her presence might once have been. Holmes opened his eyes fully. "You see, Watson," said he quietly, "a man who carries such shadows upon him will always find enemies eager to exploit them. At Holmes's request, the Count produced the series of blackmail notes, each carefully folded and secured with the remnants of a broken seal. Holmes spread them out upon the table and bent over them with the rapt intensity of a naturalist observing a rare specimen. The handwriting was bold, yet strangely uneven, as though the writer sought to mask a natural hand beneath the guise of strength. Russian proverbs were interspersed with curt English phrases, some rendered with peculiar stiffness, betraying unfamiliarity with our tongue. "Observe here, Watson," said Holmes, tapping lightly upon the page with his forefinger. "The Russian idiom is correct enough, but the English betrays haste and affectation. One who wishes to appear confident will often press too heavily upon the pen. See how the nib digs into the fibres here, where the word silence is written. A native Englishman would write it smoothly, without such hesitation." The Count watched anxiously as Holmes examined the edges of the paper, even lifting it to his nostrils. "A faint perfume, of oriental extraction," he remarked. "It clings to the fibres. You will note, Watson, that it is the same lingering scent we observed earlier, when first these letters were placed before us." Holmes studied the remnants of the seals. Wax of Russian manufacture, but the impression marred, deliberately perhaps, or in careless haste. The scratches around it suggest a sealstone that has been tampered with, possibly borrowed. It is an attempt at misdirection, but even in deceit, one leaves an honest trail. I examined the papers myself, but could glean little save that they bore an aura of menace which made my skin crawl. "What is demanded of you, Count?" I asked. Orloff's features hardened. "Gold and silence. They threaten to drag into the light that which I have striven these many years to bury. If I yield, I am disgraced. If I resist, I am destroyed." Holmes laid the letters down and regarded our visitor with grave composure. "Then, Count, it is fortunate you have sought me, for though shadows may be long, they are dispersed by the smallest ray of light." Holmes had sat for some minutes with the letters spread before him, his thin lips pursed and his brows drawn into a line of thoughtful intensity. At length he rose and, crossing to the window, looked down upon the restless traffic of Baker Street as though the answer might be writ in the shuffle of its crowds. "Consider, Watson," said he presently, "that such letters as these must emanate from one who moves in close orbit about the Count. The hand is not that of a stranger plucking rumours from the wind, but of an enemy who knows enough of Orloff's past to strike with precision. Where, then, does such knowledge reside?" I ventured that it might be some adversary from Russia itself, reaching across the seas to pursue him. Holmes shook his head. "No, my dear fellow. To send letters from St. Petersburg is clumsy, uncertain, and perilous. This is work conducted here, in London, where the émigré circles abound. You know well that half the cafes of Soho and Bloomsbury ring with the voices of exiles, men who plot against their old masters or against one another. Among such a community, suspicion and rivalry breed as swiftly as mould upon damp bread." The Count inclined his head gravely. "It is true. Many of my countrymen here are divided, some loyal to the Tsar, others to the Revolution, and still others to none but themselves. I have enemies among them, though I cannot say which hand now strikes against me." Holmes returned to his seat. "Just so. It is within those fractious circles that we must seek the author. An embassy attaché, a disaffected officer, a dispossessed noble. It may be any of these. The letters smell of London ink, not Russian snow." His words, calmly spoken, carried with them the chill of implication, and I confess I felt anew the sense that we were treading close to dangers born not merely of personal enmity, but of politics dark and implacable. Holmes gathered the letters once more, stacking them with fastidious care before laying them aside. He turned then to the Count with a look that was at once searching and inscrutable. "Permit me, sir," said he, "a few observations which may assist us." He lifted a sheet of the stationery from his desk drawer. "This, as you perceive, is of English manufacture, common enough among our stationers, yet the hand which employs it strives to conceal its origin by clothing itself in Russian phrase. The juxtaposition is telling, a foreign mind working with English tools. He took up one of the letters and traced his finger over the broken seal. See the scratches around the wax, too deliberate for accident. The sealstone used was either borrowed or counterfeit, the marks left in its haste betraying the deception. The writer wished to cloak himself in authority, yet in doing so revealed his own subterfuge. Then, holding the page close to his face, Holmes inhaled lightly. And here we have the final note of the composition, a faint but persistent perfume. It is not of the ordinary varieties favoured in London, but of oriental character, heavier and more lingering. Such details, Watson, speak with the clarity of witnesses. The Count shifted uneasily in his chair, his dark eyes flashing with a mixture of apprehension and admiration. I could not restrain myself from asking, "And what do these witnesses declare, Holmes?" He leaned back, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling. "They tell me, my dear Watson, that we stand upon the threshold of a masquerade. Behind these words lies not merely a blackmailer, but a hand skilled in deception, moving within circles close enough to the Count to wound him, yet cautious enough to hide behind borrowed masks. It is in those shadows that we must seek our adversary." It was upon Holmes's suggestion, the very next evening, that we set forth to trace the Russian threads which had begun to weave themselves into this curious tapestry. The Count had retired into his own reticence, leaving Holmes convinced that the answers lay not in his guarded lips, but among the dark enclaves of his displaced countrymen. We took a cab through streets ever narrower and more obscure, until the lamps dwindled and the fog seemed to hang thicker in the air. The houses bore the mark of poverty, their windows dim and their stairways crumbling. Yet from behind those unpromising doors issued the murmur of many tongues, the harsh cadence of Russian most often rising above the rest. It was a London unseen by the general populace, a city within a city, where suspicion bred like rats in the shadows. Holmes strode with unerring confidence, his thin figure cutting a path as though he had walked those alleys a dozen times before. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "how the faces we pass glance at us with equal parts curiosity and distrust. These men are exiles, some driven forth by political decree, others by the weight of private disgrace. Among them, loyalty is a commodity, betrayal a trade." I could not deny the oppressive atmosphere that clung to the quarter. It seemed to me that each passing figure might conceal a dagger in his breast, each whispered word a conspiracy hatched against throne or minister. The very air was heavy with secrets unspoken yet palpable. Holmes halted before a meanly painted doorway. "This, Watson," said he, "is one of the gathering places of which I spoke. Within these walls you shall hear more truth than a score of embassies would ever yield. But truth, when filtered through the lips of exiles, is oft as dangerous as any lie." With that, he ushered me inside. The interior was thick with smoke, the air heavy with the mingled odours of tobacco and cheap spirits. Wooden tables were crowded with men whose faces bore the stamp of suffering and endurance. Soldiers turned beggars, nobles turned agitators, clerks turned spies. Their voices, though muffled by the haze, carried the bitterness of exile and the longing of men severed from their native soil. We seated ourselves unobtrusively at a corner table, though I confess that my English countenance seemed ill-fitted for concealment. Holmes, however, slipped into the background as naturally as a shadow, his keen eyes flicking from group to group with the calm assurance of one who studies a map. "Mark you, Watson," he whispered, "the division is plain. There, at the far end, sit the loyalists who dream of restoration and imperial favour. To the left, the revolutionaries who would pull down every palace brick by brick. Between them, a third party, the opportunists, men who sell information to the highest bidder. It is among that faction that we must look most closely." The clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, the scrape of a chair, all seemed but the surface to a deeper current of intrigue. Conversations were held in half-whispers, yet sharp words, treason, duel, spy, carried to my ear like sparks in the dark. I could not shake the sensation that every eye, though apparently fixed upon its own company, was aware of us. One elderly man, his beard yellowed with age and his gaze unsteady with drink, muttered to a companion, "The Count, always the Count. Even in London his shadow walks among us." His words struck me like a blow, though Holmes merely inclined his head, as though such confirmation were the merest trifle. It seemed to me that in that dim chamber we sat not in a cafe, but in the very crossroads of empires, where vengeance and patriotism mingled so closely as to be indistinguishable. And I knew, with a sense of foreboding, that we had stepped into a world where the past of Count Orloff was not buried, but alive and waiting to ensnare us. As Holmes's scrutiny roved from face to face, I felt the curious sensation of being watched myself. More than once, my gaze returned to a solitary figure who sat in the shadowed recess near the door. He was pale to the point of cadaverous, his features narrow, his eyes fixed with an intensity that made me start whenever they met mine. Unlike the others, who talked in groups or huddled over cards, this man appeared wholly absorbed in us, though he made some pretense of nursing a glass before him. I whispered my observation to Holmes. He did not so much as turn his head, but answered in a tone of studied indifference. "Yes, Watson. I have noted him these past 10 minutes. Do not be alarmed. His gaze may prove more instructive than hostile. Indeed, I expected some such sentinel." "You expected him?" I exclaimed softly. Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. "Where conspiracies gather, a watcher is never far. The only surprise would be if none had been set upon our trail." The man's eyes, grey and penetrating, seemed to follow every movement, even the raising of my cup. Once, when Holmes shifted slightly in his seat, I thought I caught the glimmer of recognition on the stranger's face, quickly veiled again beneath his expressionless mask. I confessed to a quickening of the pulse. There was in that pale face something almost spectral, as though the hatred of a lifetime had distilled itself into those piercing orbs. Yet Holmes sat as unconcerned as though he were in his own armchair at Baker Street, contentedly listening to the babble of foreign tongues. "Fear not, my dear fellow," he murmured at last. "He watches us, but it is we who learn the more." It was shortly thereafter that fortune, in its crooked way, provided us with a clue. An elderly man, shabby in attire and unsteady of gait, lurched towards our table with a half-empty glass. His beard was yellowed with age and tobacco, and his eyes swam with drink. Mistaking me for some sympathetic countryman, perhaps by my moustache or the cut of my coat, he addressed me in broken English, punctuated by guttural Russian oaths. "The Count," he muttered thickly, leaning too close for comfort. "Always the Count. He thinks we forget, eh? But we remember, oh yes, we remember the duel at St. Petersburg, blood on the snow, and the woman, the woman who vanished like smoke." I started at the words, but Holmes, without turning, laid a hand upon my sleeve, a silent injunction to restraint. "What woman?" I asked as calmly as I could, though my heart beat fast. The old man wagged a finger, his breath sour with spirits. "She was his once, but she went where? None know. Dead, perhaps. Hidden, perhaps. But she is in it, always in it. Mark me." With a sudden laugh that ended in a cough, he reeled away, his mutterings lost in the general clamour of the room. I looked to Holmes in astonishment. "Did you hear, Holmes? He spoke of Orloff's duel and of a vanished woman. Surely these are threads we cannot ignore." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "On the contrary, Watson, they are threads of the very fabric itself. Loose lips, even when soaked in vodka, sometimes let slip truths the sober tongue would guard. You have just heard more than you yet comprehend." When at last we quitted that dismal den, the foggy air of the street felt almost wholesome by contrast. Yet I could not shake the image of the pale-eyed watcher and the drunken whisperers hints of duels and vanished women. "Holmes," said I, "we tread dangerous ground. If even half of what that old man implied be true, Orloff's past is a pit of intrigue deeper than we imagined." Holmes walked beside me with his usual deliberate stride, his hands behind his back. "Dangerous indeed, Watson. Remember this. In émigré circles, patriotism is but another mask. A quarrel that seems political may conceal a personal vendetta, and a personal wrong, clothed in the garments of ideology, may blaze fiercer than any cause." He paused, and his keen eyes seemed to pierce the mist ahead. "We are walking upon tinder, my dear fellow. One spark, one careless step, and the whole structure may burst into flame." I shivered, not from the night's chill, but from the prescience of his words. It was on the following day that Holmes proposed we should pay a call upon the Count's residence in Grosvenor Square. As we drew near, I could not help but observe the imposing grandeur of the house, its facade marked by stately proportions, and its windows hung with heavy curtains that seemed to repel rather than invite the light. Yet beneath that appearance of wealth and dignity, there lingered an air of secrecy, as though the very stones of the mansion bore witness to matters best left unspoken. Holmes paused for a moment at the foot of the steps, his eyes ranging across the street with that peculiar scrutiny of his, which missed nothing. "You perceive, Watson," said he, "the blinds are drawn unevenly. That tells me of a household that has no settled rhythm. Either its inhabitants are in turmoil, or they endeavour to present a semblance which deceives only themselves." As we approached the door, a carriage clattered past, its curtains drawn. I fancied I caught a fleeting glance from within, though it was gone in an instant. The whole quarter seemed, in that moment, to bristle with hidden eyes and ears. Inside, the air was heavy with a kind of watchful silence, broken only by the faint echo of our own steps. I confess that, despite Holmes's calm demeanour, I felt a sensation of unease, as though we had crossed the threshold into a place where fear had taken up residence alongside wealth. We were received by Ivan, the Count's ancient retainer, a man whose back was bowed with years yet, whose eyes retained the keen light of vigilance. His aspect was one of suspicion, and his first words, delivered in a voice roughened by long service, were edged with mistrust. "Why do you come? The Count has no wish for visitors," said he, his gaze darting from Holmes to myself with the guarded look of a sentinel. Holmes regarded him steadily. "We come at the Count's own behest, my good fellow. It is in his service that we stand here, not against it. Your loyalty is admirable, but misplaced suspicion serves only your master's enemies." The old man's face softened, though the lines of care remained. "Enemies," he muttered. "Yes, always enemies. Since we came to this cursed city, I have felt them near. Footsteps in the night, shadows at the window. There is no peace, even in England. They will not let him rest." With that, his manner altered. What had begun as suspicion transformed into a reluctant confession of his fears. He spoke of letters arriving at odd hours, of strangers lingering too long by the railings, and of the Count's own increasing agitation. His voice shook, and he crossed himself more than once. Holmes listened with quiet attentiveness. "You are wise to be wary," said he gently. "Your fears are not without foundation. But courage, Ivan. Truth, once unearthed, is often less terrible than shadows left unexplored." As we made our way through the hall, my attention was caught by the sudden sound of hurried steps upon the stairs. A figure descended with evident haste, a woman, slender, closely veiled, her head bowed as though to conceal her features. She passed us without a word, her pace quick, almost furtive, and within moments she had vanished through the doorway to the street. I turned to Holmes in astonishment, but he was already following the trace of her passage with those hawk-like eyes of his. He stooped, as though to examine some faint sign upon the carpet, and when he rose there was a curious light in his expression. "Did you observe her, Watson?" he asked quietly. "Indeed I did," said I. "Who could she be, and why such haste?" Holmes raised his hand for silence, and then, taking from his pocket one of the blackmail letters, he held it delicately between his fingers. "Here," he said. "You may detect the faint aroma of an oriental perfume. And there," he motioned to the space where the lady had just passed. "The very same note lingers still upon the air. There can be little doubt, my dear fellow, that our mysterious correspondent is not without a woman's hand in the matter." The discovery startled me more than I cared to admit. That a woman should be entwined in such dark affairs lent the case an added gravity. Holmes, however, seemed less surprised than gratified, as though one of his conjectures had been confirmed by a simple experiment. "Every puzzle, Watson," he remarked, "is but a mask, and when one mask is lifted, another is revealed beneath. We have glimpsed our lady, but not yet her purpose." As we took our leave of Grosvenor Square, my mind was troubled with a sense of foreboding. The splendour of the Count's house had proved but a hollow shell, concealing within it the stirrings of fear, intrigue, and secrets which seemed bound to burst forth in calamity. The veiled woman, the trembling retainer, the whispered enemies. It was all of a piece, and I could not escape the conviction that we had placed ourselves upon the edge of a matter whose consequences might reach far beyond the fate of one man. The thought of political scandal, of strained relations between nations, rose before me like a spectre. "Holmes," said I, "do you not feel the peril in which we stand? If such things as we have witnessed today were made public, they could scarcely fail to stir an uproar." My friend gave a thin smile. "You are right, Watson, but remember, danger is our natural element. It is not the peril which disquiets me, but the pattern. These events are not isolated. They are pieces of a design, and it is that design I must unravel." His composure did little to soothe my unease. I felt, as we walked into the gathering dusk, that we were no longer mere observers of a mystery, but actors drawn into a drama whose ending none could yet foresee. The following morning found Holmes in one of his most energetic moods, the languor of his violin-playing days quite gone, replaced by the brisk activity of a strategist preparing his campaign. He sat at his desk with pen in hand, while I watched in curiosity as he composed a letter whose very phrasing was as cryptic to me as the riddles we sought to unravel. "This, Watson," said he at last, waving the sheet aloft, "is bait for a most particular fish. You perceive I have imitated, with sufficient fidelity, the Count's hand, and yet I have sown within these lines certain suggestions which no true friend would pen. If our adversary watches closely, as I am certain he does, this letter shall draw him forth as surely as cheese tempts the mouse." I read the draft with growing admiration. It purported to be a reply to the latest threat, hinting at compliance yet naming a fictitious time and place for the exchange. The deception was complete, and I marvelled at Holmes's ingenuity in weaving both plausibility and entrapment into so short a composition. "Will it succeed?" I asked. "My dear fellow," Holmes replied, sealing the letter with deliberate care, "success or failure is but a matter of the adversary's nerve. If he takes the bait, we shall know him. If he resists, then we have at least learned something of his caution. In either case, knowledge accrues." The missive was dispatched by a messenger boy within the hour. Holmes paced the room, his sharp profile cut against the light of the window, as though already rehearsing the next act of his design. "The stage is set, Watson," he murmured. "The trap awaits its quarry. Now we must prepare to observe the play where it will be performed, in the very heart of Russian society." It was some 2 evenings later that Holmes and I found ourselves amidst the dazzling splendour of a Russian ball, held in honour of a visiting dignitary, but thronged as much by London's expatriate colony as by its native aristocracy. The great hall glittered with chandeliers, the air alive with the strains of violins, and the shifting of silken gowns across polished floors lent an air of enchantment which could almost have made me forget the darker purpose of our presence. Holmes, however, was impervious to such distractions. Though he bowed with the punctilious grace of a gentleman, his eyes missed no detail, darting from group to group with the precision of a hawk scanning the fields below. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "That splendor is but the curtain. Behind it, the actors wait. See how the émigrés cluster together, whispering in corners, while the diplomats keep their distance with studied civility. It is not a gathering of friends but of adversaries, compelled to don polite masks." I could not fail to note the nervous vigilance of certain figures, men who started at the sound of a name, women whose gloved hands trembled as they raised their glasses. It was evident that beneath the glitter of jewels there lay the unease of intrigue. More than once I thought I detected a veiled figure moving among the crowd with curious haste, and once I glimpsed, at the far end of the hall, a pale face whose piercing eyes stirred my memory of the watcher in the cafe. Holmes's lips tightened ever so slightly, but he gave no sign beyond that. "We are in the lion's den, Watson," he remarked, his voice low and measured. "Now, let us see which lion is tempted by the scent of prey." Holmes had contrived a simple but effective disguise for the evening, one which rendered him less conspicuous to the sharp eyes of those who knew him by reputation. With a modest alteration to his hair and the addition of a foreign affectation to his attire, he blended into the throng as though he were one more émigré diplomat among the glittering assembly. I, for my part, remained by his side, though my role was little more than that of observer. It was during the second hour of the ball, while a quadrille was in progress, that Holmes gave my arm the slightest pressure and directed my gaze towards a shadowed alcove beyond the great mirrors. There, half hidden from the revelry, stood a woman closely veiled. Even through the folds of lace, I thought I recognized the grace of the figure we had glimpsed at Grosvenor Square. Presently, a man approached her with furtive steps. His face was pale and sharply lined, his eyes glittering with that same unnerving brilliance I had noted before in the Russian cafe. Though he stood but a moment in the full light, there was no mistaking him for any casual guest. His air was one of suppressed fury and bitter watchfulness. Holmes, leaning lightly upon his cane, moved us nearer, feigning interest in a tapestry. I caught fragments of their hurried conversation, spoken first in Russian, then in broken English. There was mention of letters, of promises not yet fulfilled, and of vengeance still demanded. The woman's voice trembled, though whether from fear or loyalty I could not discern. The stranger's hand clenched upon her wrist. She recoiled, but he released her with a gesture of disdain and melted back into the crowd. Holmes's eyes followed him with the calm intensity of a hunter who has at last sighted his quarry. "We are near the end of our search, Watson," he murmured, "but the curtain has not yet risen upon the final act. Let us be patient, for our adversary will soon reveal himself." It was not long before Holmes's prophecy was fulfilled. A stir passed through the company as the veiled lady, pale and shaken, attempted to withdraw from the assembly. The pale-eyed man, however, had not departed. He emerged once more, and in the brief commotion of the dancers, Holmes contrived to intercept him. With a deftness that astonished me, my companion dropped his assumed accent and fixed the man with a glance that was as cold as steel. "Colonel Sokolov," said he, in tones that carried no uncertainty, "your masquerade is ended." The effect was electric. The man started back, his face draining of what little colour it possessed. A murmur of recognition rippled among the Russian guests, some uttering exclamations of amazement. I caught the name Sokolov hissed from more than one lip, followed by whispers that spoke of duels, dishonour, and treachery. The Count's old rival, long believed to have perished upon the snow of St. Petersburg, stood alive before us, his deception shattered by Holmes's unerring deduction. Yet even as Holmes reached to restrain him, the colonel acted with desperate speed. With a sudden movement, he thrust aside a group of startled revellers, overturning a candelabrum and plunging a portion of the hall into confusion. Cries of alarm rose, the music faltered, and in that instant of tumult, he vanished into the press of bodies, leaving behind only a ripple of disorder and the acrid scent of spilled wax. Holmes, though swift, could not pursue him through the crowd without attracting greater uproar. He contented himself with a glance towards me, his expression one of mingled triumph and frustration. "We have named our adversary, Watson," he said grimly, "though the snare has not yet closed upon him. But mark my words, the Colonel cannot remain long in shadow now that the light has found him." The events which followed the ball impressed themselves upon my memory with the vividness of a nightmare. It was late on the succeeding evening when Holmes and I were hastily summoned to the Count's residence in Grosvenor Square. The message, delivered by a terrified servant, spoke of a calamity which had befallen his master, and Holmes lost no time in ordering a cab to carry us thither. I confess that a chill ran through me as we entered the mansion. Ivan, the old retainer, met us in the hall with a face of abject despair. "It is death, gentlemen," he cried in his broken English. "The Count, he is dying." With trembling hands, he led us upstairs to a chamber wherein lay our client, stretched upon his bed, his features drawn and ghastly, his breath issuing in painful gasps. Beside the bed stood a physician, summoned in haste from the neighbourhood, who turned to us with a look of grave concern. "It is poison," said he. "The symptoms are unmistakable. Violent spasms, constriction of the throat, and that pallor which bespeaks a deadly draught." Holmes, however, bent swiftly over the patient, examining his lips, his hands, and the disordered bedclothes. "The Count will live," said he at last, his tone cool and authoritative. "The quantity administered was insufficient to achieve its purpose. Prompt remedies will suffice. But the question is not one of cure, it is of crime." He motioned the physician to continue his ministrations and drew me aside. "Mark the circumstances, Watson. The door was locked from within, the windows fastened, yet our man lies stricken as though death itself had entered unbidden. We are in the presence of one of those enigmas which delight me most: a locked chamber, a poisoned draught, and an unseen hand." At that moment, I could not share his intellectual exhilaration. I looked upon the stricken Count with pity and upon the shadowed chamber with dread, as though some malevolent spirit had crept into it with the night. Holmes's next action was to approach a small table which stood beside the bed. Upon it rested a single glass, half filled with water. He took it up, holding it delicately by the rim, and studied it intently under the lamplight. "You will observe, Watson," said he, "that this vessel bears only the Count's fingerprints. That fact might persuade a casual observer that he alone had touched it. Yet I declare to you that this glass is the very key to the mystery. I examined it myself, but could perceive nothing beyond the obvious. The surface bore the smudged traces of handling, and the liquid within gave off no unusual odour. Surely, I said, it speaks only of the Count's own use. Holmes's eyes gleamed. On the contrary, it proclaims the presence of another. Consider the angle at which it was placed, the slight displacement upon the ring of moisture where it once stood, the fact that it rests upon the left side of the table when the Count is right-handed. These are trifles, yet trifles are the very essence of truth. He replaced the glass with scrupulous care, his expression one of profound absorption. There is, too, a faint smear along the rim, so faint that even you, my dear Watson, might overlook it. Yet under this light you may perceive it, a subtle stain, the merest trace of rouge, such as a lady might wear. I started in astonishment. A woman? Then the intruder was... Holmes raised his hand for silence. Patience, Watson. Let us not leap before the evidence compels us. But I will say this. The locked door deceives only those who forget that the human heart is the most permeable barrier of all. The Count is not the only one in peril. There is another whose shadow now falls across this case. Holmes motioned me nearer to the lamplight, where the faint smear upon the rim of the glass was visible if one looked with sufficient care. You perceive, Watson, said he. The discoloration is not from the lips of our unfortunate patient, but from the cosmetic artifice of a woman. Rouge such as this is not uncommon in fashionable circles, yet it betrays a presence which the locked door would deny. I bent closer, and indeed with effort, I could discern the barest trace of colour clinging to the surface. But how could she have entered? I asked, when the key was found upon the inside, the bolt fastened, and every avenue secure? Holmes gave a slight shrug. You fall, my dear fellow, into the error of supposing that appearances are synonymous with truth. A locked door may deceive the dullard, but it cannot deceive the eye that reads the language of objects. Look again at the position of the glass, placed to the left when the Count is right-handed. Would he so inconveniently reach across himself? The displacement tells me it was set down by another hand. He straightened, his gaze sharpening. This veiled lady, whose perfume clings alike to her garments and to these letters, has not merely hovered at the fringes of this affair. She has stood at its very heart. Whether in compassion, coercion, or collusion, she has brought herself within the chamber of the Count. A thrill of mingled dread and fascination coursed through me. The thought that a woman, perhaps the same whose figure we had glimpsed in haste, should thus intrude upon a man's very bedchamber, bearing with her the menace of poison, filled me with profound unease. Holmes, however, remained serenely detached, as though these revelations were but natural steps in a logical progression. Holmes, I cried, you cannot mean that this lady, whoever she may be, is herself guilty of this murderous attempt. Surely there must be some mistake. A woman's hand is not fashioned for such deeds. Holmes regarded me with a faint smile that betrayed neither mockery nor indulgence, but rather that quiet superiority with which he so often tempered my protests. Your chivalry does you credit, Watson, but it is perilous in the realm of fact. The heart, you see, is the most dangerous conspirator of all. Do not forget that jealousy, ambition, and revenge have armed women's hands with deadlier weapons than any man might wield. I could find no ready answer. My mind recoiled from the image of that veiled figure descending the staircase at Grosvenor Square, now transformed in my imagination into the bearer of a poisoned draught. It seemed incredible, almost monstrous, that the grace of her step and the delicacy of her form could mask such a deed. Holmes, seeing my perturbation, laid a hand lightly upon my shoulder. Take comfort, Watson. I do not yet assert her guilt, only her presence. Whether she came in malice or in mercy, whether she brought death or sought to forestall it, is a question still to be resolved. But this much I will affirm. Where the heart is concerned, logic finds its most formidable adversary. He turned once more to the bedside of the Count, whose breathing had grown steadier under the physician's care. The heart often conspires with the hand, my dear Watson, Holmes added gravely. And until we learn the nature of that conspiracy, we shall remain at the mercy of shadows. It was Holmes's firm belief that the matter could not be prolonged without imminent peril to all concerned. Accordingly, he contrived a meeting which, for its secrecy and delicacy, surpassed any I had yet attended in his company. In a dimly lit chamber belonging to a discreet acquaintance of Holmes's near the Strand, we gathered at his request, Count Orloff, pale and visibly shaken by recent events, the veiled lady, whose presence was revealed at last to us as Countess Irina, and finally, summoned by means best known to Holmes, the pale-eyed stranger we had unmasked at the ball, Colonel Sokoloff himself. The atmosphere was thick with tension, for each of the three bore within them a history of passion and betrayal, and it seemed to me that but a spark was needed to ignite the powder of their enmities. The Count stood stiffly, his arms folded, pride and shame contending upon his face. Irina's veil had been discarded, and her features, though beautiful, were drawn with the anguish of a soul torn between love and loyalty. Sokoloff, gaunt and implacable, watched them both with the cold satisfaction of a man who believes his moment of triumph has arrived. Holmes alone remained calm. He presided over the strange tribunal with the air of a judge who has already discerned the verdict, though he awaits the formalities of its expression. "We are here," said he, "not for recrimination, but for truth. The web of lies and secrets has ensnared too many lives. Tonight it must be untangled." His words fell like a gavel, and for a time none dared answer. The silence, charged with unspoken memories, was more eloquent than speech. At length, it was Irina who broke the silence, her voice trembling, but resolute. "You must know, Dr. Watson, that once I was pledged to Count Orloff. He was to be my husband, my protector, my future. Yet in those turbulent days at St. Petersburg, plots and suspicions clouded every bond. Colonel Sokolov, who had long envied him, contrived to wrest me from his side." Orloff's face darkened, but he did not speak. It was Sokolov who gave a low, mirthless laugh. "Yes, it was I who claimed her, not by love, but by stratagem. And when the Count sought redress, we met upon the snow at dawn. They think me slain, yet behold me alive, and stronger for the falsehood." I glanced at Orloff in astonishment. "Then the duel was a deception," said Irina bitterly. "The pistols were loaded with treachery. Orloff fired, but the colonel had contrived his survival. He was borne away in secrecy, and the tale of his death was spread to all." Holmes regarded them with keen interest. Thus the world believed the quarrel ended, when in truth it had only begun. A duel is designed to close a matter, but here it served as the opening of a darker chapter. Irina's eyes filled with tears. "I was forced, against my will, into the colonel's keeping. My loyalty was torn between the man I loved and the man who held me in his grasp. In that conflict, I betrayed them both, and myself most of all." The Count turned aside, his silence more terrible than reproach. It was Sokolov who now spoke, his voice hard and unyielding. "You ask my purpose. It is simple. Vengeance. Orloff dishonored me before all Russia, and though the world thought me dead, I have lived only for this hour. The secret of his treason lies in my hand, and I have wielded it as a dagger." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Treason is a grave word, Colonel. You accuse him, then, not only of dishonor but of betrayal to his country?" Sokolov's eyes glittered. "Yes. He consorted with enemies of the state, trafficked in secrets, and risked the security of his sovereign. The woman was but one part of it. For that, I threatened exposure, knowing that even the whisper of such a charge would ruin him." Orloff's face blanched, and for a moment he seemed about to speak, but Holmes raised his hand. "You mistake the effect of your threats, Colonel. Blackmail is a weapon that consumes its wielder. You have shown us your motive, but I sense the truth runs deeper. For your enmity is not content with scandal, it hungers for destruction." Sokolov sneered. "Perhaps, but destruction is well deserved." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "That is yet to be determined. What you reveal is sufficient to explain the threats and the poison, but I perceive behind it another shadow, a darkness not born of politics, but of passion. When that truth comes to light, Colonel, it may prove your undoing." There was a moment of silence, heavy with anticipation, as though the chamber itself held its breath for Holmes's next revelation. The following evening we assembled once more, this time in the drawing room of our Baker Street lodgings, where Holmes had contrived to gather all the actors in that tragic drama. Count Orloff, gaunt and hollow-eyed from his recent peril, sat opposite Colonel Sokolov, whose countenance betrayed neither fear nor shame, but a cold defiance that seemed to mock even the gravity of his position. Between them, pale and downcast, was Countess Irina, her veil discarded, her beauty dimmed by sorrow and inward conflict. Holmes stood before the fire, his figure straight and commanding, his eyes gleaming with that penetrating light I had learned to associate with the hour of revelation. "The play is nearly concluded," said he, "and the time has come when truth can no longer be masked by silence or deceit. We stand upon the threshold of scandal and ruin, but knowledge may yet avert catastrophe." Turning first to the Count, he continued, "You, sir, have sought to conceal certain episodes of your past, episodes of which you now reap the harvest. The duel in St. Petersburg, which the world believed had ended in Sokolov's death, was, in truth, but a deceit. The colonel lived, spirited away by conspirators, his supposed corpse but a phantom created for public credulity." Sokolov inclined his head with grim satisfaction, while Holmes pressed on. And you, Countess, were the unwilling pivot of this intrigue. Betrothed to Orloff, yet by force and stratagem delivered into Sokolov's hands, you became the very prize for which these men contended. Your silence, born of shame and of fear, gave to the colonel his power and to the count his dishonor. Irina covered her face with her hands, a sob escaping her lips. Holmes's voice, however, did not soften. The result was inevitable. The colonel, hungering for vengeance, revived himself in exile and turned his hand to blackmail. The count, striving to protect his honor and his nation, sank deeper into concealment. And you, madam, torn between love and dread, hovered like a shadow across both their paths. That is the truth which each of you has sought to evade, but which stands now unveiled before us. The silence that followed was profound. Even the tick of the clock seemed to accentuate the finality of Holmes's words. Holmes, having laid bare the human motives, now turned to the chain of evidence which had guided him from the outset. "It is well, Watson," said he, "to trace not only the passions of men, but also the material trifles by which those passions betray themselves. Let me account for each." He held up the first of the blackmail letters. Here, the scent of an oriental perfume, rare, and detected by my nose the instant the paper was placed before me. The same note clung to the Countess's garments as she fled from Grosvenor Square. The inference was plain. The letters were penned, or at least delivered, by her hand. Whether in compulsion or collusion, the fact of her presence was undeniable. Next, he drew attention to the broken seals. You will recall, Watson, the scratches about the wax. Such marks occur only when a sealstone is ill-fitted to its impression, suggesting that the device had been borrowed or imitated. That pointed me to a conspirator familiar with diplomatic circles, where such trinkets abound, and narrowed my gaze upon the émigré colony. Then he took up the poisoned glass. Upon it were found only the Count's fingerprints, an artifice to mislead. Yet the displacement upon the table, its alignment upon the left, though the Count is right-handed, spoke of another hand. And there, faint but damning, the smear of rouge. That detail alone sufficed to prove a woman's involvement. Holmes turned to the Count. Your demeanour, sir, told me the rest. A man haunted by a duel, and by a woman's name he dared not utter, must inevitably be prey to an enemy who shared those secrets. The duel was no death, but a deception. The enemy, no phantom, but Sokolov returned to life. And the woman, no stranger but the Countess herself. He concluded with calm finality. Thus the perfume, the seals, the glass, and your very silence all converged to a single point, from which the truth radiated with irresistible clarity. Each clue, trifling in itself, became decisive in combination. That is the logic of this case, and it admits of no other explanation. When Holmes had ceased, none spoke for some moments. The Count sat with bowed head, his proud shoulders bent beneath the weight of shame. The Countess wept silently, her hands clasped in mute supplication, while Sokolov glowered, his lips curled in defiance, yet his silence betraying the collapse of his designs. Holmes alone seemed untouched by the passions that surged about us. Standing by the fire, he gazed into the glowing embers with an expression of cool abstraction, as though the case had already passed from the realm of peril into that of intellectual retrospect. At last he spoke. You perceive, Watson, how politics and love, those two most potent forces in human affairs, are oft but masks for ambition. Behind the duel, the blackmail, and the poison lay not statecraft nor patriotism, but pride, jealousy, and the thirst for power. The intrigues of courts and the passions of hearts are but different garments for the same restless spirit. He turned towards us, his face grave. It is well that such truths should remain hidden from the public gaze. The honour of nations is fragile, and it is sometimes wiser to let shadows lie undisturbed. For though reason may unveil them, it cannot mend the ruin they bring. Then, with that touch of melancholy which at times tempered his brilliance, he added, "The darkest mysteries, Watson, are seldom of the intellect. They are of the human heart. And in that labyrinth, reason itself may falter." With those words, the case was, in essence, concluded, though its echoes lingered long in my memory, entwining love, treachery, and ambition in a knot only Holmes could have severed. It was some days later that I learned, through discreet channels, of Count Orloff's departure from England. No public announcement heralded his going. No farewell was taken of the diplomatic circles he had frequented. He vanished as silently as he had come, leaving behind him nothing but whispers of his presence and conjectures as to his fall. Holmes, who had watched the course of events with his customary detachment, remarked only that the man had escaped the exposure which might have shaken two governments, yet he bore within him a ruin as complete as any wrought by scandal. His pride, once the very armour of his being, had been pierced beyond repair. He departed diminished, a shadow of the man who had first crossed our threshold in Baker Street. I could not help but feel a measure of pity for him. Though his faults were grave, he had been ensnared in a web of passions and rivalries larger than any one man could master. His silence was the price of peace, but it was also the silence of defeat. Thus Count Alexei Orloff passed from our shores, his fate thereafter a mystery into which even Holmes did not inquire. Colonel Sokolov's end was less dignified. By Holmes's arrangement, Scotland Yard was apprised of his identity, though with such caution as ensured that no public trial would inflame diplomatic relations. Instead, he was quietly handed to representatives of his own country, whose interest in reclaiming him was as much political as judicial. I recall Holmes's words on the matter: "Exile makes of a man either a penitent or a fanatic." Sokolov was of the latter breed. His return to Russian hands will strip him of the stage upon which he has strutted, and that is punishment enough. What his ultimate fate in Russia may have been, I never learned. Some said he was confined in a fortress on the Neva, others that he vanished into the endless wastes of Siberia. Whatever the truth, his shadow passed from London, and with it a menace that had darkened the Count's path and threatened scandal upon two nations. For my own part, I could not easily dismiss the melancholy which clung to this affair. It seemed to me a tale not of villains and heroes, but of men and women undone by the very qualities that once gave them greatness. Pride, passion, and secrecy, these had been the instruments of Orloff's rise, and equally of his ruin. I reflected that the duel in St. Petersburg, the blackmail in London, and the poison in Grosvenor Square were but successive chapters of the same tragedy. Each act sprang from the desire to guard honour, yet each drew its actors further into dishonour. How often, I thought, does a man seek to bury his past, only to find it rising again with redoubled force? And how often do love and loyalty, when twisted by fear, become as deadly as hatred? The shadows of the human heart, once kindled by passion, consume even the noblest of intentions. It was late one evening, as I sat with Holmes in our familiar sitting room, that I gave voice to my reflections. "This case, Holmes," said I, "has left me with a heaviness I cannot shake. It seemed less a triumph of reason than a chronicle of ruin." Holmes, who had been leaning back with half-closed eyes, opened them and regarded me with grave composure. "You are right, Watson," said he. "Not all mysteries end with neat justice or restored honour. There are some in which truth serves not to heal, but to expose the frailty of human hearts." He paused, and then with quiet emphasis added, "The greatest mysteries, Watson, are not of the mind, but of the human heart. That is where even reason falters." With that, he lapsed again into silence, and I, respecting his mood, asked no more. Yet his words lingered long with me, as though they were the epitaph of the strange and sorrowful adventure of the Russian Count. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the last coils of smoke from his pipe curling upwards, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You see, Watson," said he, "the shadows that haunt men are seldom political or diplomatic. They are born of pride, of passion, and of love betrayed. That is where the truest mysteries lie, and where reason, for all its sharpness, must bow before the storms of the human heart. What do you think, then? Was Colonel Sokolov's greatest mistake his deception, his vengeance, or the underestimation of Holmes's eye? Share your thoughts below. And if this tale has held you, I invite you to comment, subscribe, and share it with others who enjoy a journey into Holmes's world of deduction and intrigue.